Normandy, summer 1944. A Sherman is moving somewhere beyond the hedgerow. You hear it before you see it. Inside the tree line, 4 German crewmen are waiting in a machine so low that the wheat nearly hides its roof. No turret, no tall silhouette, just a sloped steel nose, and a long gun already pointed at the gap. The Sherman appears. The German vehicle does not swing a turret toward it. It cannot. The driver aimed the entire hull at this opening almost an hour ago. Now the gunner only has to wait for the tank to cross one thin line in his sight. The Sherman rolls forward, half a length, one length, then the low box fires. At 500 yards, the shell does not need a second chance. The weapon that fired it is the kind Allied crews learned to fear from the Panther. But there is no Panther in the trees. There is only a cheap, turretless box built on an old Panzer IV chassis. And that contradiction explains one of the most practical armored vehicles Germany produced in the final year of the war. Germany's late war problem was not that it had forgotten how to design lethal machines. The Panther was lethal. The Jagdpanzer was lethal. The problem was that Germany could not build enough of either one. So German industry made a colder calculation. Keep the gun, lose the turret, use the old production line. In other words, when Germany could no longer afford the whole cat, it tried to save the teeth. The vehicle most people call the Jagdpanzer IV was not one single machine. It was a family. And before the story goes any further, that distinction matters. The first production version entered service in early 1944 with the shorter 7.5cm L-48 gun. Germany built roughly 769 of them between January and November. That weapon was already dangerous. It was related to the gun used by late Panzer IV tanks in the Stug III. Against a Sherman or a T-34 at ordinary combat distances, it was not a consolation prize. It was enough. But it was not the Panther's gun. The real transformation came later. In the summer of 1944, the low Panzer ivory-based hull received the long 7.5cm L-70. That version became the Panzer IV 70. One factory, Wehrmacht, built the lower, cleaner version, usually marked with a V. Another producer, Alkit, built a taller interim version marked with an A, using a less heavily altered Panzer IV hull because the purpose-built vehicle could not be supplied fast enough. The two versions were not equally elegant. That was not the point. One was the design Germany wanted. The other was the design Germany could put into production immediately. Together, the factories completed about 1,208 long gun vehicles, 930 from Wehrmacht, 278 from Alkit. Add the earlier short gun machines, and the whole family comes to just under 2,000. But the number that drives this story is 1,208. Those were the low boxes carrying Panther-class firepower. Not a similar idea, not a weaker copy. The long L-70 used the same cartridge family, the same barrel length, and essentially the same ballistic performance associated with the Panther's famous main gun. The mounting was different because one weapon sat in a turret and the other sat in a fixed casemate. The effect on the target was not. At 500 yards, the standard armor-piercing round could defeat roughly 5 inches of armor under test conditions. At 1,000 yards, it still had more than 4 inches of penetration. A Sherman did not carry 5 inches of frontal armor. Neither did a T-34. That meant the Panzer IV 70 was not merely capable of killing the common Allied tanks it faced. It could do it from ranges where those tanks still look small in the sight. This is where the machine's reputation becomes confusing. People often assume a cheap vehicle must be a weak vehicle. But the Panzer 70 was cheap in the part Germany could afford to simplify. It was not cheap in the part that killed tanks. It saved money by deleting the turret, not by weakening the gun. A turret is one of the most expensive and difficult assemblies on a tank. It requires a large precision-machined ring, traverse equipment, a basket, electrical or hydraulic systems, internal space arranged around a rotating structure, and enough manufacturing accuracy to make all of that work while the hull flexes, the vehicle shakes, and the crew fights inside it. Remove the turret, and a great deal of industrial pain disappears with it. The Panzer IV 70 replaced that rotating machinery with a fixed armored roof and a narrow gun mount. That did not make the vehicle simple in every sense, but it made it more compatible with a chassis Germany already knew how to build. The Panzer IV production system had existed since before the war. The tooling was established. The workforce understood the hull. The supply chain already knew the suspension, engine, tracks, and transmission. Germany did not have to create an entirely new industrial organism. It only had to graft a new fighting compartment and a much more powerful gun onto one that already existed. That was the hidden advantage. The Panther was a new and demanding machine. The Panzer IV chassis was old, familiar, and already paid for in knowledge. There is a price often repeated online for the Jagdpanzer IV, about 99,500 Reichsmarks. It sounds precise. The problem is that the figure is difficult to trace to a reliable wartime price list, so it should not be treated as sacred. The safer comparison is the surrounding evidence. A turreted Panzer IV cost about 103,000 Reichsmarks. A Panther cost about 117,000. A Stooge 3, another turretless fighting vehicle, cost roughly 82,500. Those figures show the industrial direction even if the exact Jagdpanzer invoice remains uncertain. A turretless vehicle built on the Panzer IV chassis should cost less than the turreted tank built on that same chassis. And it should cost comfortably less than a Panther. The strongest proof is not the price tag, it is the production ratio. Germany completed only 415 Jagdpanthers during the entire war. 415 premium tank destroyers built on the Panther chassis. Against them stood 1,208 Panzer IV-70s carrying the same class of long gun. Roughly 3 old chassis gun boxes for every 1 Jagdpanther. That ratio is the real cost argument. Not because the Panzer IV-70 was free, not because it was better, because it was repeatable, and repeatability is what the late-war German armored force was running out of. The machine paid for that efficiency with almost every comfort a tank crew valued. The first problem was visible the moment the long gun was installed. The L-70 barrel was heavy. It projected far beyond the front plate. The later vehicle also carried thicker frontal armor. Together, the gun and armor pulled the center of gravity forward until the suspension seemed to kneel. The front road wheels wore rapidly. Rubber rims could peel away under the load. Later vehicles received steel-rimmed front road wheels because the nose had become too punishing for the original arrangement. The crews gave the vehicle a nickname, Guderian's Duck. It waddled, the front dug in, the rear sat higher, and every sharp turn reminded the driver that the gun was hanging far ahead of the first road wheel. The name was funny. The handling problem was not. A turreted tank could rotate its gun toward a threat without moving the hull. The Panzer IV-70 could traverse its weapon only a small distance to either side, roughly 10 to 12 degrees. Anything beyond that required the driver to move the entire vehicle. Tracks scraped. The engine rose. The hull pivoted. The camouflage shifted. The machine that had been almost invisible a second earlier suddenly announced itself to everyone nearby. In a prepared ambush, that limitation barely mattered. The crew had already aimed the hull. The target came into the gun line. The weapon fired. But in a fluid battle, especially on open ground, the fixed gun became a trap. A Sherman appearing 30 degrees to the side was not simply a new target. It was a new driving problem, and the Panzer IV-70 did not see sideways very well. 4 men occupied the low fighting compartment. The driver sat forward. Behind and around the gun were the commander, gunner, and loader. There was no 5th crewman to reduce the workload. There was no spacious turret with broad observation. There was a long breech, thick recoil guards, ammunition racks, steel walls, and 4 human bodies competing for the same narrow volume. The commander could see forward. He could see fragments of the sides. The rear was mostly a rumor. Buttoned up, the crew fought through periscopes and slits while the battlefield moved around them faster than the hull could turn. Then there was the ammunition. The L-70 fired a large fixed round more than 2 feet long. Inside a Panther turret, the loader had room to establish a rhythm. Inside the Panzer 70, he worked in a low armored corridor with the breech recoiling into the same space where he needed to move his shoulders. Every reload was physical. Pull the round free. Rotate it in a space that resisted rotation. Guide it past steel edges. Drive it into the breech. Get clear before the gun came back. The long gun made the vehicle deadly. It also made the crew serve the weapon like men feeding a furnace in a closet. The armor followed the same logic. The front was strong. On the later version, the main frontal plate reached around 80 millimeters and was sharply sloped. At range, that could defeat many ordinary Allied anti-tank hits. But the sides were far thinner, the rear thinner still. The vehicle was built around one direction, forward. Point the strongest armor and the strongest gun at the enemy. Hide the flanks. Avoid being surprised. Do not let the fight become circular. That is not the design of a general-purpose tank. It is the design of an ambush weapon. And in the right ground it worked. The hedgerows of Normandy were almost made for it. The banks and vegetation broke sight lines. Narrow lanes funneled movement. A low vehicle could disappear behind earth and leaves. The limited traverse mattered less, because the terrain already restricted where an enemy tank could emerge. The Panzer 70 could wait with its hull aligned to a gap, expose almost nothing, and fire before the target understood what it had found. In that environment, the machine's weakness became less visible while its advantages became brutal. Low silhouette, strong frontal plate, accurate long gun, prepared line of fire. But Germany did not always use it that way. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht had too few vehicles for every machine to remain in its ideal role. Tank destroyers were pushed forward like tanks. They were sent into infantry attacks. They were ordered across open ground. They were used in mobile battles where threats appeared from several directions at once. There, the fixed gun and weak side armor stopped being design compromises and became causes of death. A vehicle built to wait was forced to advance. A vehicle built to face one direction was forced to fight in all directions. A vehicle built to disappear was ordered to move under observation. That was the darkest truth of the Panzer IV. Its flaws were not mysterious. German officers knew them. The crews knew them. The designers knew them. The war simply stopped allowing the vehicle to choose the kind of battle it had been designed to win. The long gun versions reached the field as Germany's strategic position was collapsing. They fought in France. They appeared in the Ardennes during the winter offensive of 1944. They served across the Eastern Front as German formations were pushed back toward the Reich. Wherever a defensive line needed anti-tank power, and there were not enough Panthers or Jagdpanthers to provide it, the old Panzer IV chassis received another long gun and went forward. That does not mean everyone supported the program. Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Germany's armored troops, objected to it. The nickname attached to the vehicle was not a tribute. His argument was practical. The Stugethur already existed. It was cheaper, it performed much of the same defensive work, and every Panzer IV hull turned into a tank destroyer was one less hull available for a turreted Panzer IV. Albert Speer's armaments organization had similar concerns. From a production planner's desk, the program looked like duplication. Why spend a scarce tank chassis on another turretless vehicle when the Stug III was already doing the job? Because the Stug III could not carry this answer as effectively. Its shorter L-48 was a good gun. The long L-70 was another level of reach and armor defeat. Against the most common Allied tanks at normal ranges, both weapons were dangerous. But at longer distances and against heavier late-war armor, the long gun created a margin the Stug could not match. That margin was the entire reason to tolerate the Duck. The Panzer IV did not justify itself by being a better Stug. It justified itself by being the cheapest practical road from an existing German production line to the Panther's ballistic performance. That is why the vehicle matters. Not because it was elegant, it was not. Not because crews loved it, many did not. Not because it produced a mythical kill count. No surviving ledger can honestly assign an exact number of Allied tanks to this vehicle, and any clean total would be guesswork. It matters because it reveals what industrial warfare looks like after prestige collapses. At the beginning of a weapons program, engineers ask what the best vehicle could be. Near the end of a losing war, factories ask what lethal part can still be produced. Germany could still build some Panthers. It could still build a few Jagdpanthers, but the numbers told the truth. 415 Jagdpanthers, 1,208 long-gun Panzer IV. The premium machine was better. The old chassis box was available almost 3 times as often. That did not make the Panzer IV a secret super tank. It made it something more useful to a collapsing army. A first-class gun carried by second-choice architecture. A weapon system built by subtraction. Remove the turret. Accept the blindness. Accept the cramped crew. Accept the nose-heavy suspension. Keep the old hull moving down the line. Keep the long gun pointed toward the road. The Panther and Jagdpanther became legends because they looked like legends. Large, complex, predatory. The Panzer IV looked like a steel shed pressed flat by its own gun. But fame measures what people remember. Production measures what a country can repeat. And by 1944, repetition mattered more than perfection. Germany could no longer afford the cat, so it kept the teeth.